Hey, Warrior Next Door listeners, we always have something special on tap, and today we're going to feature one of 11 Pearl Harbor survivors who are still with us. His name is Earl, aka Chuck Kohler. He was on Ford Island and fought back against the Japanese when they attacked Pearl Harbor. He was recently featured on the National Memorial Day Concert that took place on Sunday, May 24th at 8 p.m. on PBS. That's right, he was featured on PBS. We were offered the opportunity to interview him, and of course we could not turn that down. We are blessed and grateful that we're able to, and now we're going to share the full-length interview with Earl, aka Chuck Kohler, with you today. Sit back and enjoy. All right, Warrior Next Door listeners, we always start off our show by saying stuff like, we got something really special for you today. And that's because every veteran we interview is special to us. But we actually do have something special today.
Yeah, it is.
Not that the other veterans we interviewed are less special. They're still special, but we've got something extra special, spicy special. If you had told Ryan and I that we'd have a chance to interview veterans from World War II in 2026, back when we started this in 2001 and 2, we would have thought you were crazy. If you had told us that in 2026, we were going to be able to interview a World War II veteran who is a Pearl Harbor survivor, I believe one of 11 left alive in the world, we would have said, you're really, really crazy. It's ridiculous. How could we ever be graced enough, blessed enough, special enough, important enough to have access to someone like that? Worthy enough, that's the word. But Warrior Next Door listeners, that's exactly what we have on tap today. Today, we have someone named Earl Kohler, aka Chuck, as he was called, a nickname during World War II, a Pearl Harbor survivor. And you may ask yourself, you may wonder, as the Talking Head song goes, you may ask yourself, how did we get here? How did the Warrior Next Door end up being able to interview Earl Chuck Kohler? And I am going to hand it off to my co-host, Ryan Fairfield, because he did the legwork on this. Ryan, how in the heck did this happen?
Well, we receive emails. Like Dave Letterman says, letters. We get lots of letters. We get emails from people, and a lot of times they're kind of spam, but sometimes you have to really read them and you realize, no, this is a sincere person. And we got reached out to by a PR firm in Los Angeles to see if we would consider basically in an ancillary way being a part of the National Memorial Day Concert. Now, what that entails is, if you're not familiar with the National Memorial Day Concert, it's been going on now this is the 37th year. And what they do is they have military bands from the different, from the Army, Navy, Air Corps, Marines that actually provide orchestral type music in the background. It's set on the west lawn of the U.S. Capitol. It's hosted by Gary Sinise, or Lieutenant Dan, for those of you who may not know from Forrest Gump. Everybody knows who Lieutenant Dan is.
Heck yeah.
And also Joe Mantegna. He's a co-host. He's another great actor. And what they do is they have a theme every year, and they pick a few veterans to honor. And then they'll have a Hollywood actor do a dramatic reading live in front of this entire gigantic audience of people outdoors on the west lawn of the U.S. Capitol. And they read a first-person account from this veteran. Then afterwards, the veteran stands up in the crowd, and everyone gives them, of course, a great standing ovation. Well, honestly, I have to admit, I was really not very aware of this sort of thing, of the National Memorial Day Concert.
And real quick, Ryan, this is generated and produced by PBS.
That's correct. Yeah,
it's the most watched, highest rated program that they produce throughout the entire year. And I'm with you. I don't remember watching it. Maybe I was too busy drinking beer on Memorial Day, but I'll be watching it this year.
That's true. It's Memorial Day weekend. What are a lot of people doing? They're out at the lake, they're camping, who knows what they're doing. But regardless, this is going to happen at 7 p.m. Eastern time on the Sunday before Memorial Day. And anyway, getting back to the story, though, they reached out to us and said, would you guys like to be able to interview one of the veterans prior to the memorial concert? And so we started corresponding back and forth with the PR firm, and we got our pick of the people that we could interview. One was going to be a 9/11 survivor and their story at the Pentagon. And then one is our friend here, Mr. Chuck Kohler. course, he's a World War II veteran. We would jump at the chance to interview a World War II veteran. The opportunities are getting rarer and rarer these days. So, Mr. Kohler has a story that is just fantastic.
Yeah.
His story, and you'll hear about it as we get going through here. Yep. I'm not going to tell you too much about it here because it is extremely riveting when he gets into telling you the nitty-gritty of his action by action event that he went through on Pearl Harbor, on the day of Pearl Harbor. So that's how this whole thing got started. So what we're doing as the podcast, we're privileged enough to interview Mr. Kohler ahead of time. And then our podcast, as you're listening to it right now, airs the day after the concert on Memorial Day. So the concert itself, if you want to see Chuck in the flesh, you want to see him on TV, you want to see which actor they chose to do the dramatic reading, and you're going to recognize him. It's going to be a fantastic show. I guarantee you it'll touch you. And I'm going to be recording it. I'm going to be watching it. It's going to be a fantastic thing. It's a great thing. And it's a great honor for us as a podcast to be involved in this sort of thing.
100%. And so May 25th, that's Memorial Day. It's a Monday. That's when it's going to air. For those
the series will air.
That's when the series will air. Correct. So this will drop in the morning of that day.
Right.
Correct.
So
for those listeners who are devout to the show and listen to it regularly, you'll hear this and have a chance to watch it live later on during the day on Monday. For those who heard this weeks or months or years afterwards, well, there's something called the interwebs, and they have the YouTube videos, and PBS has their own channel on there. So if you couldn't watch it live, please go to the online version and check it out. I can't wait to see it, especially after learning more about what these people do on the PR side to produce this every year. And the actor they got is amazing. They always get amazing actors. In the past, they've had like Bryan Cranston and Sam Elliott. So we're talking about some A-listers here. And after all that being said, and as excited as Ryan and I are about what's going to happen with PBS and our little piece of that, I think the real treasure for Ryan and I is just being able to be connected through this event to someone who's 102 years old, was a Pearl Harbor survivor, a participant in what occurred there, and did a bunch of amazing stuff afterwards. If nothing else happened, if the only thing, and I'm using air quotes for only, happened was us to interview Chuck Kohler, man, that would have been a freaking slam dunk. The fact that all of this ties into being able to be able to share Chuck's story and what he did with a wider audience on a day of remembrance just makes it that much better.
It is, Chuck's one of those guys that fought back. And we all can think of people that we've seen stories about with regard to the attack at Pearl Harbor, and stories of individuals fighting back. This guy here fought back, and you're going to hear his story, and it's fantastic.
So we're going to roll in some clips right now. We're going to start off the clips. We want people to get, before we get into and he tells you what he did in Pearl Harbor, we want to get to know Chuck a little bit. So we're going to play a few clips that talk about how he grew up, where he grew up, what it was like in the Great Depression, and how that led to him going to war. So Ryan, let's kick it off with the first clip.
I grew up on a farm near to the village of Audubon, Minnesota. It was just a little small village. I think there was one or two stores, maybe a gas station, a few things like that. But that was all we needed to get by. We were very self-sufficient on a farm. We had everything. Mother made our own bread, our own butter, our own cheese, and all that stuff. So it was just the coffee and the spices and a few things like that people needed from the store.
What was it like growing up in a small town during the Great Depression as a farmer?
Well, it was a lot of animal husbandry. We would have up to 60 head of horses at a time. We were farming a square, what they called a section of land, a square mile of land, and then had another 100 acres of meandered land that was attached to it. So there was always a lot of work. all the time. There was more work than you could do. When you got big enough to do work, you had big work to do, believe you me. Never have had much time for anything other than work. Just work, work, work. You know, uh, those when you got that many animals, they're always needing, to be get to the watering spots and feeding them. And I know most of my time in the mornings, I would maybe get up about 5 o'clock in the morning and be up there doing all the chores and putting all the feed out for them and everything else. Then when I got home in the afternoon, I would have to go and clean up that food from behind them after they had processed it through their. Yeah. I had 5 brothers and 4 sisters. There were 10 of us.
Wow.
In the family.
And the Kohler name, is that German? Did your father homestead that area?
My paternal grandfather was from Metz, Germany, and my maternal grandmother was from Bern, Switzerland.
And did they homestead that farm? Did they come over from Europe?
We did not own the farm. We were what they call sharecroppers. You know, the people that own the land, the farmers in Mechanic State Bank in Minneapolis, Minnesota, they would provide with the seed grain and stuff like that, and then you would share. And at harvest time, 1 payday a year on the farm. You know?
Think about that. So we're going to stop here just to remind our audience that this experience for a lot of the veterans who served in World War II was not uncommon. We were still very much an agrarian society. We were going through the Great Depression. A lot of people didn't own the land that they farmed. A lot of people think sharecropping occurs down south in the Mississippi Delta, but it occurred throughout the United States. Audubon, Minnesota, where he's from, is in northwestern Minnesota. It's due east of Fargo. It's in the middle of nowhere. It's a tiny town. And you heard him. He had 10, siblings that basically worked their butts off every day doing farming where they didn't own the land. The owner would give them some seed, say, if it grows, you can keep a part of it and I'll give you a share of it. That's predicated on the price. It didn't take into account if you had any bad weather or hail. If that happened, I don't know what these people did. And then when they got paid, they had to live on that paycheck and any other types of bartering or work they did throughout the year. Kind of a tough life, Ryan. I'm sure it was a lot like you grew up in Illinois, right? That was a rural community. Did you give it 5 a.m. and sharecrop?
Oh yeah, every day, man. I was out there slaving away. No, I grew up in a farming town of about 800 people, but I was still called the city boy because I lived in town. Okay, everybody else lived on the farms outside town. So real quick, I just want to state, my dad was from a large farming family. My mom was from a large farming family. My father-in-law was from a large farming family. And for the guys, for the boys, not that the women's jobs weren't hard, because they were doing the things like butchering the chickens to make the meals for the family and everything, and doing the laundry and all that kind of stuff, which is it's not easy work to do.
It sucked for everyone on a farm.
It sucked for everybody. But at the same time, my dad grew up, he was born in 1944. My father-in-law was born in 49. They were still doing this lifestyle of work all the way up into the 1960s, and to this day, my mom's family still owns their family farm, as does my father-in-law. And guess what? They're essentially sharecropping. They're renting out. It's cash rent for crops. Basically, it's the same thing. Yep. Somebody comes in and says, hey, you own the land. I got the equipment. If I farm it for you, can I get 50% of the crops? Well, sure. And guess what? That's a huge benefit for the landowner, especially if you've acquired all this land over all these decades, even centuries. My mom's farm, my mom's family's farm has been in the family well over a century. So there's a lot. I'm going to sneeze. Hold on a second.
No, that's all right.
No, I'm not. Okay. So it's full skull. Anyway, right. Long story short, that's it. So
let me ask you a few questions, because I grew up in a big city. How close was the nearest proper hospital? You grew up in there in the 80s, 1980s, not 1930s. How close was the nearest proper hospital from your house?
30 miles.
Okay. So if there was an emergency, you'd have to get your butt in a car and go there and hope that you were still alive by the time you drove.
Or call the ambulance. There was the local rural ambulance, of volunteers, mind you.
There you go.
That would show up in the ambulance that's been bought by the local municipality, and people have had first aid training, but they're not nurses. They're not medical people.
So
there's risk involved. Yeah.
You made my point is that I think a lot of things we take for granted today in the United States, which is more urban, there's a lot more people, there's a lot less space between cities and towns, there's a lot more trained professionals who are willing to live in these smaller towns. There's a lot of things that happen in these small towns that are very difficult, and they were even more difficult back then. And in this next clip, you're going to hear him talk about some of these things that can occur there that, we typically don't have to worry about today.
Other than, I had a young cousin that passed away when he was about 13 years old. I forget what it was that he had, but medical service of any kind was not all that handy there where I grew up. Because doctors usually go where there's a good economy, so they've got a better income. So there was one doctor there, but he was limited to what he could do. The things he had and stuff like that. He was very limited to what he could do. I had fallen off a chair. We were running around and jumping from chair to chair or whatever we could do to give ourselves, and I fell off the chair. Bit my tongue half off. So the doctor, when they took me to him, he said, "Well, there's nothing they could do." They didn't do stitches at that time, as I recall, and stuff like that. So he said, "Well, there's nothing really I can do." But he said he's lucky because if that where he bit his tongue, if that had went just a hair's width further, he would have bled to death before you could have got him here. So I escaped. I escaped there when I was just a young kid.
So he speaks with a slight lisp, and in ancient Greece, that was a sign of sophistication, actually, believe it or not. People who had a slight lisp when they talked were seen as fantastic orators and sophisticated individuals. Okay. In this case, they were playing jump the chairs, bit his tongue, literally bit a chunk of his tongue off. He showed us. And if it had bit his tongue a little bit deeper, he could have bled to death. He talked earlier in a clip about a young cousin who died. We've interviewed a bunch of people like Bill Parker who had people who passed away. We've had people talk about taking their siblings to school on a horse and buggy in a rural school, and their brother fell off the wagon and got run over and died on the side of the road. What I'm trying to say is our ability to feel safe and secure and a phone call away from an emergency is something that they just didn't have back then. And I think we forget about that. And I thought it was cool that Chuck reminded us something little like that can lead to terrible consequences when you're in the middle of nowhere.
Well, I got to say, when he stuck out his tongue and showed us that gigantic scar, he did almost bite his whole tongue off.
Yep.
It's crazy. Now, I can kind of relate to him on the pain of biting through your tongue, because whenever I was in college, I had a ski boat, and I'd take my friends out. We'd go knee boarding all the time at this lake nearby. Well, one day I was pulling, two people were actually on knee boards. Okay. And I was one of the guys, and one of my friends was driving. So we would do this whole kind of gladiator thing. We'd go out beyond the wake
and slam into each other.
And we'd jump the wake and we'd hit in midair. Completely stupid. Okay. Now, think about his mom. I always told you not to jump around in the house. Look at what happened to him, right? See, I didn't have any parental supervision at this point. I was just out on the lake with a bunch of friends with a ski boat. Anyway, I bit through my tongue, but just on the side of my tongue. And I didn't get stitches or anything like that, but I was sore for a week. I couldn't eat anything. I mean, chicken broth, that was about it. With his, I can't imagine. I can't imagine the pain that he went through with that. crazy.
No, and the fact that it could almost kill them, and the fact that they had to bring a doctor from out of town, and it's just rural life back then. You had big families working on farms, dirt poor, no service around them, and that shouldn't surprise anyone when you hear what Chuck has to say in his next clip.
I knew there had to be something different than farming.
Yep.
To me, it would be better than, to me, it would fit me better than farming. So on April 3rd of 1941, I enlisted in the United States Navy. I was 17 years old at that time. They had what they called a minority cruise. You could sign up anytime during your 17th year, and your enlistment would end on your 21st birthday. So that's what I did, and boy, that was a lot more adventurous being in the service during the war than being there on the farm, and that being there on December 7th of 1941 at Pearl Harbor, 17 years old, I was assigned the security watch. So it happened on my watch. You can blame me if you want to. But getting through the things that I did during World War II made me so fiercely independent, that and it's just stayed with me all of my life, and it has served me very, very well.
I want to take you back to just prior to your enlistment. What was the feeling at the time about the winds of war? Was there a feeling in the air or talk in the air that you knew we would eventually end up in this war?
Well, as you said, the winds of war were blowing, and everybody knew it. And I'm surprised that I was able to get, my dear sweet mother to help me get my father's signature. I had to have my parents' signature to join the service. And I can only imagine what a mother must feel like when she's sending her son off to war, But she knew that's what I wanted to do and needed to do. And so she helped me get my dad's signature. And it was maybe one of the best moves I ever made, because like I say, it made me fiercely independent. And
I just want to jump in real quick and say that, he mentioned April 41. He was 17 years old, or he enlisted in April of 1941, and it was good for 4 years, right? He had to serve for 4 years. So what's that? That puts you to April of 45. Boy, what an opportune moment for him to have enlisted. He covered the entire war almost to the month, at least with the European theater, but he wouldn't serve in the European theater. But at the same time, 4 years that seemed like a long time when you think about it. Was it always like that for the Navy or other branches of the military?
Yes, it could be. There were different enlistment types, and he talked about being part of the minority crews. He came in younger. My grandfather, Phil Dion, did the same thing. He joined the war, went in the Navy, served on USS Colorado. He joined the war before Pearl Harbor was attacked. And his idea was, the winds of war are blowing, as you put it. I know this is going to happen. I'm not going to wait to get drafted, because there was already a peacetime draft. He said, I'm not going to wait for my number to get called. I'm going to join the service I want to join and fight the way I want to fight. And that's something that Chuck said something similar. The other thing that we hear a lot from people we've interviewed from this time period is working on a farm was so hard that being in the military actually appealed to them. And in the next clip, you ask a question. We'll let Chuck elucidate on that, where it's like, yeah, that was better than living on a farm. There were things that happened there that didn't happen on the farm. But I would say, though, Ryan, correct me if I'm wrong, the vast majority of the people that we have interviewed either were enlisted after the war, like the war started and they're like, I'm going to go after those guys, or were drafted after the war. We don't have a lot of people we interviewed who were this young on a minority cruise and enlisted before the war. And that's why they had the 4-year hitch, because instead of being brought in as a 20-year-old, college student where you could do a 3-year hitch, The minority cruise was 4 years. And you're going to hear more about that in later clips. But yeah, 4 years was kind of like my dad served in Vietnam. He enlisted in the Navy. It was a 4-year hitch.
No kidding.
Yeah.
I know that some of the guys like in the Marine Corps in Vietnam, there was a 13-month deal.
So a lot of those guys were drafted. And the deal was you were drafted, you went through boot camp, you served 1 tour of Vietnam, you served a year over there and you were out. Unless you re-enlisted. And then you
That's true. It was 13 months in the theater, but you had training up before that. So it was like 2 years or something like
exactly.
that.
Whereas this is completely different because that stipulation was never in place. It was like once you were drafted, and quite frankly, once you enlisted and the war started, you were kind of there until the war ended or you died or got captured or hurt so bad you couldn't fight anymore. So now we're going to play the next 2 clips back to back. I always say that, and sometimes we stop in the middle because something happens. We're like, wait a minute, let's talk about that. But this is going to be about boot camp and what he got trained to do.
A neighbor had joined the Navy, and he came home on leave, and he was talking about all the things he was getting to do and the places he was going. They would be here, and then they would sail and be over there and stuff like that. And so that just sounded like the place to go to me. And so that's what one of the things that helped me to decide to join the Navy.
So could you tell us about your experiences during boot camp and what you got trained to do?
Well, I took my training at the Naval Air Training Facility at what they call Great Lakes, Illinois, on the shores of Lake Michigan, and when I completed that, they gave us what they called a boot leave. I think we got 21 days or something like that. And before we left on leave, we put down, they gave us 3 choices, what we wanted to do, where we wanted to go, whether to the East Coast or the West Coast, and what you wanted to do. I put in there that I was really, really interested in aircraft and flying. I put in there that's what I wanted to do, and I'd had enough cold. I didn't want to go to the East Coast, so I thought I wanted to go to the West Coast. And when I come back, I was so glad to see that I got all of my requests answered. We started out as engine mechanics, and that only went on for about a week, and the order came down from the Bureau of Naval Personnel to train to change a certain amount of us, about 80%, to aviation metalsmith, sheet metal repair, because they figured, I think someone thought, now, wait a minute, if the engine gets shot up, the plane maybe won't get back to the ship or to the base or whatever the case may be, but it can be riddled with bullet holes if it doesn't hit something that's vital, like the pilot or the fuel lines or something like that. It'll maybe get back, to where it can be repaired. So they changed us over to metalsmith, and I was very disappointed. But I came to realize later how thankful I was that I was one of those that was changed, because the skills that I learned there as a metalsmith, the welding and all that different stuff, I've used all the days of my life since, And if I'd been an engine mechanic, there's not many people that have an airplane in their backyard, So there was no call for that kind of work. But for the metalsmith, there was always work.
Yeah. So that's what he was trained to do, was to basically repair and maintain the fuselage of aircraft, as opposed to fixing the engines. And just in full disclosure, Chuck has been interviewed by the Library of Congress before this interview was conducted, and it's available, and you can watch it, and I did. And it was done when he was a sprightly young lad of, I think, 84 years old when they interviewed him. So like 20 some years ago.
20 years ago.
Yeah, totally. Right. And so one of the things he said in there that he didn't add here, he was telling the person who was interviewing him that I'm 86 or whatever he was. He goes, and I'm still working. I was a metalsmith during the war, and it has allowed me to be a metalsmith and be actively employed and earn a good living my entire life. This dude was still doing side projects as a metalsmith in his 80s. So to say, as he just did, that it really benefited him later in life is a bit of an understatement.
Well, I just want to say one thing, a couple questions.
Yeah.
First of all, for him to be working on airplanes during World War II means he would have had to have been doing aluminum welding.
Yes. Yep.
I guess I didn't realize, and I guess I should have. I don't know why I would think this. I thought that was kind of more of a newer thing, but it sounds like was definitely something obviously that they were doing way back then.
Yeah, I don't know how much aluminum welding they were doing on a fuselage. A lot of it was rivet work, rivet patches. And sealing, but they may have been, Ryan. I'm not saying that they did.
So you're saying that he was doing not necessarily welding, but all manners of metal work.
Absolutely. These things would come in with holes and things torn out, and they would have to cut out that section, create a new one. And the metal smithing part was these things had curves and contours to them.
Yeah.
And they would use these big rollers and everything to basically recreate what they did in a factory with a stamping machine. They did it by hand, and then they would put the patch there and they would rivet and seal it and send them on their way. So those sort of skills became, I mean, it's literally in art form. If you see people take a piece of sheet steel, you may have remembered the show years ago, Orange County Choppers, where they had a guy that they made custom motorcycles, and they would often use these rollers and stuff to make one of a kind shaped pieces of metal for those custom bikes. Well, as a metal smith, he was able to use that skill set at least through when he was in his 80s. When I had a chance to watch that video, he was really proud of the fact and let her know, I think she was in the Army, that, hey, I'm still working. I'm not even done yet.
Yeah. I mean, that's awesome. You know, and I think a lot of people that live to be the ripe old age of 102 and going,
he might still be working for all I know. I have no idea.
Having a career that's something that you can do and it gives you a purpose to get up for every single day speaks volumes to how your longevity plays out for you and your health too. One of the things I was just going to ask, and is when these guys are repairing these fuselages and stuff, if a piece of shrapnel goes through some structural component of the plane, like a rib work of the plane or some spar, do they have all these parts on like in storage there to like rebuild some of these planes, or do they have to patch up things like that? I would think that they would have to. Like let's say a wing spar gets hit by a piece of shrapnel. Obviously, this would have happened every day, with these planes going into harm's way. I just wonder what they had to do to fix those. Was it completely replacing parts like that with spares? Or was there something they could do, like maybe welding, where they could weld it all back and fix it with scrap?
Yeah, I think it depended on what it was. Like a wing spar would probably be a part that you'd have to have replaced and brought in. But we're going to learn later that the facilities that he worked on were pretty Spartan, a little dangerous, often required a rifle. So I think there was a little bit of, hey, we're the United States military, the government. We produced we produced the heck out of stuff. We're going to make that available to you. And I think a lot of it was, here's a bunch of sheet aluminum, bend it, twist it to whatever you need to do with it. So I think it's a little bit of both, Ryan. But what he's going to kick around the next clip now, he's getting out of boot, and now he's going to be deployed. And he's going to be deployed on one of my favorite ships. And I can't wait to play these clips and talk about it.
The USS Lexington was one of the largest aircraft carriers in the world.
Oh, yeah.
What was your first impression of that ship? What did you think about it when you saw it?
Well, like I say, when I got on it, and you look from side to side and end to end, it was just, and it was just a self-contained, like a little city. Everything you needed was there aboard the ship and stuff like that. And of course, you have, I forget now just what it was. I think you went forward. If you had to move about the ship, you traveled one way on one side of the ship and the other way on the other side. You went up the ladder on this side of the ship and down over on the other one. So that gets everybody flowing in the same way all the time, And boy, oh boy, there everything had a place and everything had to be in its place. If you had to use a certain something, you made sure you get it back where it was when you got to get it, so that the next guy that needed it would know where to get it. Almost every day, we would have they would do training. The aircraft would take off and come back and stuff like that. No matter which way you're going or where you're trying to get, you turn into the wind, so they don't need so much ground speed to take off as they would, because that carrier can get to going full speed. It helps with their going into the wind like that. Since I was not in the crew on that ship, my time was pretty free. I think it was 8 or 6 inch guns that we had, turrets, and there was enough room between the bottom of that turret and the turret mount, and I would crawl up in there and lay there and watch those airplanes take off and land.
Oh, I am so jealous. That would have been spectacular to have seen that, especially since Navy air at that time with aircraft carriers was a relatively new technology.
They didn't have bunks for us. Everybody was sleeping in hammocks at that time, So they told us, well, you just find a place to swing your hammock. So I got up in what they called the windlass room. It was where those big old drums would turn and pull up the anchor chains and stuff so we get going. I thought this would be the ideal place because I can lay there and look out, for that. And we got out to sea and got going. Of course, they're going up over one and then they go down through two. And boy, oh boy, that first time we went down like that, the water came in crazy. I had to move out of there real quick.
I am so jealous.
That's crazy. That's crazy.
So
to be able to crawl around the little nooks and crannies of that ship and get because like he said, he didn't have a role. He was just on a boat ride out to Pearl Harbor. But I can imagine being in this huge room with the anchor chains go down. Yep. I mean, oh my God, that'd be scary.
In the front of the ship,
right in the bow. Yes.
Yeah.
And then you go down and you're out in the water and you get the seawater pouring in through those ports. Oh my gosh, that's crazy.
It's so like Ryan already said, he wasn't serving on a Lexington. That was his ride to Pearl Harbor to work there. The next clip is going to talk more about what he did in Pearl Harbor. But the Lexington is an amazing, amazing ship, one of my favorite ships. So this was a class of 2 aircraft carriers, the Lexington and Saratoga, and they were both built on what is called battle cruiser hulls from post-World War II. Basically, it's a battleship with slightly less armor. I'm sorry, World War I. Thank you. Prior to World War I. Thank you. So these ships were left over after World War I. They were going to be built in the 1920s, but the Washington Naval Treaty was signed after World War I between Great Britain, Italy, Japan, United States, and whatnot to limit the size of our Navy so we wouldn't get into this arms race, this naval arms race. And so the United States got a clause in that agreement to convert those type of ships into aircraft carriers. Well, imagine what amounted to a battleship hull with not as much armor, didn't have the big thick armor plate on it, being turned to an aircraft carrier. If these aircraft carriers weren't the largest aircraft carriers in the world, they were the second largest. I don't know if the Brits had something as big as these. They were huge. They could go 30 plus knots. They could carry 100 plus aircraft. And because they were battle cruisers, originally they had a lot of guns left over. He's right. Those guns that he would sneak underneath to watch these Wildcats and Devastators and Vindicators take off, they were 8-inch heavy cruiser guns. When we think of the later aircraft carriers, they had the 5-inch guns before and after the island. The Lexington had 8-inch guns. They would ultimately replace those with 5-inch anti-aircraft guns. The idea being with the 8-inch guns is that if some sort of anything cruiser or lighter got close to the aircraft carrier, that they could fight it off with their own guns, which is not something most aircraft carriers can do. Unfortunately, the Lexington would not survive the war, but her sister ship, the Saratoga, would. So when you heard me say I got jealous that what he saw, I meant it. It would have been a huge, powerful ship, one of the largest ships in the world. It was fast, and it carried all of these cutting-edge attack aircraft that would have been so important just a few months after he was on this ship.
Well, and one thing I want to say here, obviously this was built using leftovers from World War I, but why wouldn't they continue forward with that model for a ship? If it's fast, it's large, what with the Essex class carriers that came along after that, what was the benefit of the Essex class carrier?
Great question. So the problem with converting something like a battle cruiser to an aircraft carrier, or any ship into an aircraft carrier, is that when you lay out the machinery, like the engines and everything like that, the boilers, they're often not laid out in such a way that allow you to carry a big hangar deck with a lot of aviation fuel tanks and the aircraft flight deck properly situated. So it was a great aircraft carrier. What made it great, it was so big, but it wasn't efficient. It didn't have the, for example, it didn't have the elevators located in an optimal place as they would learn over time to be able to launch and retrieve aircraft more quickly. The layout of the machinery, again, wasn't optimal for all the types of storage you need for aircraft, as opposed to, big barbettes for large battleship guns. Yeah. So it really wasn't until later. I think the Ranger was the first built for purpose aircraft carrier, but you started getting into the Enterprise, the Hornets, and then the Essex class, where from the ground up, they built everything to carry planes and av fuel, and the bombs.
I mean, it makes sense if you're retrofitting something like that. Bulkheads aren't going to be in the right spot for an aircraft carrier. You got to have elevators that tip things up and down. You got to have flight decks beneath you got to have storage hangars beneath the flight decks that are wide open and long that you can store and work on these big planes. And cruisers weren't really made for that sort of thing. There was no need for that. So I can see why they wouldn't necessarily stick with that, but it's not impressive nonetheless.
Yeah, it is. And what made it so impressive is it was just so damn big and so fast. It was a fantastic ship.
Yeah.
So now in the next clip, he's going to Pearl Harbor in style. Spoiler alert, that's where he's going to be stationed. Now he's going to talk about what he was assigned to do there. And you're not going to want to miss that. Join us for the second episode of the Chuck Kohler series, where next week he's going to talk about what he did at Pearl Harbor prior to war breaking out. And then, of course, where he was when Pearl Harbor was attacked, what sort of things he saw. And you're going to hear it from someone who was actually there, not something written in a book or seen in a movie, but one of 11 people still with us today who can tell us about that momentous day on December 7th, 1941. So you're not going to want to miss it. Hey, welcome back to the second installment of the Chuck Kohler series, a Pearl Harbor survivor who was on Ford Island on December 7th, 1941. Join us for this episode. He's going to tell you where he was, what he was doing, and what happened to him on that day. Here we go.
Well, once I got out there to Pearl Harbor and reported to VP-23, the aircraft that they were flying at that time were those old PBY flying boats. They couldn't operate off the land. They had to operate off the water. So somebody had, when they were going to go out on patrol, we had to go and let them down into the water, and the pilot would rev up the engine just enough, and there would be what we call we'd have a little tractor up here that would, back up slowly and let them out into the water. Where they got buoyant, where they would be fully afloat, then somebody had to go out and take those wheels off and to let it go. And I was assigned to the main landing gear on the port side. There were 3 of us, and those brackets on those landing gear would fit down to what they call the chime on the lower edge of the aircraft's hull. And there would be pins you dropped in there, and then up on top there was, with that fit in there, you had a big pin that had to go through there. So we would go out there. It would take three of us. We would hold that wheel in against the thing and take those bottom pins out, let that wheel float up like that. Then another guy would pull a top pin out, and then we'd take that ashore. And when that was all clear, we'd give the pilot the high signal sign, and he would taxi out and take off.
Yeah. So
it was exciting for a farm boy.
Totally. What he's talking about is he was assigned to the seaplane base on the south end of Ford Island. You're going to hear more about that later. The seaplane base had what was called PBY Catalinas, and these were developed in the 30s as a purpose-built. There's two things. There's a float plane, which is a plane that you put floats on. It can land like in Alaska waters and stuff. And there's a flying boat where the hull is actually a boat. It's got a boat hull on the bottom of it. And that's what the PBY was. It stood for Patrol Bomber. And then the Y in the PBY was the letter designation from the Defense Department for the Consolidated Airplane Company, which would also make the B-24s with the high wings, right?
Right. I was just going to say, I was actually just looking to see if the B-24 was inspired by the PBY, because it was the same. It was a similar sort of thing. It had the high wing. Yeah, go ahead.
No, it totally.
I don't want to steal your thunder. Go ahead.
No, there's no. We're kicking the PBY. So we mentioned, if you listen to last week's series on Glenn Crum, a fighter pilot in World War II, we mentioned some of the source material we got was from source material that was from a YouTube site called Greg's Airplanes. Well, I had a chance to peruse Greg's Airplanes YouTube channel again a few nights ago, and he had an episode on there as what was the most underappreciated or unsung bomber plane in World War II. And here's how he starts it off. He says, "What if I told you that this plane that is what my pick, Greg's Airplanes, this is Greg's pick for the most underappreciated, most prolific, powerful bomber used by the Allies in World War II. What if he said it was at, what if I told you this plane was at Pearl Harbor? What if I told you that the first bombing raid ever conducted by aircraft on Japanese installations on December 27th, 1941, before the Doolittle raid, was conducted by this aircraft? What if I told you that this aircraft would shoot down the first Japanese fighter of the war, of any plane? What if I told you this plane allowed us to see the Japanese fleet at Midway a day before the Japanese knew where we were, and maybe contributed the single most force multiplier effect, seeing the enemy earlier, that allowed us to win the Battle of Midway? What if I told you that this plane would end up sinking more ships, more tonnage of freighters than any other airplane in the Pacific theater?
Really?
Well, that's how Greg's Airplane starts off. And when you listen to this, you're like, what the hell plane is this? Is it an Avenger? But that's not underappreciated. Exactly. It turns out it's the PBY. The PBY was built, they made about 3,300 of them. It had a range of about 2,000 miles. A typical mission was 12 to 15 hours. Yeah. The ship, the way it was laid out, I called a ship, the airplane was laid out like a ship, where the bulkheads, that's what they called the big frames that separated the different sections of the ship. They called them bulkheads, like a ship, were actually watertight compartments. They had the ability, they had a hot plate and a stove, they could make coffee, they could eat food, they had bunks, you could sleep, they had a lavatory. It was an amazing aircraft. They only had a maximum speed of about 179 miles an hour and a cruising speed of more like 120 to 150. But it was their ability to range and loiter at low elevations that made them so special. And offensively, and we'll talk more about the offensive power in a later clip, but for offensive operations, the aircraft was equipped with the Norden bomb sight. Right?
Really?
Yes,
I did not know that.
Early in the war, they thought the best way to attack shipping was high altitude bombing. Later on, they realized that there was another way, a better way. We're going to talk about that in a later clip. It could carry 4,000 pounds of bombs. That's B-17-esque, okay? It could carry 4,000 pounds of bombs, anti-shipping mines, and 4 325-pound depth charges. It could carry 30 or 50 caliber machine guns in the nose, and in what was called the side blisters, these bubbles that stuck out from the port and starboard side of this flying boat to help defend itself. This plane was absolutely amazing. And what he talks about with taking the wheels off and going in the water, the earlier marks of these PBYs literally had struts that with tires, wheels that bolted to the side of the plane. So when they landed in the water, you had to go out in the water, bolt these on, and then they could roll up a ramp on shore. Later marks, the most widely produced one, the PBY 5A, would actually have the landing gear retractable in the hull so that they could. I mean, it's one thing to have guys go in the water in a Pearl Harbor to do that, but could you imagine doing that in the Aleutian Islands?
Oh my gosh, no, I can't imagine that. I'm just going to say, this with the PBY coming into basically into being in the mid 1930s. What else was going on in the 1930s? You had the Pan Am Clippers that were going from the West Coast, flying through Hawaii, stopping at some of these little islands, and going all the way to the Far East.
Yep.
And some of that technology for long-term flight and carrying a lot of cargo would no doubt be put to use in the design of the PBY, I would suspect. They weren't the same plane, because the Pan Am Clipper used a Boeing plane, whereas this was a consolidated plane. But nonetheless, I would imagine that they learned a lot from that era of being able to fly those planes across the Pacific Ocean like that. And, at the same time, get a little bit of military research in on that. Like, hey, how can we make this plane fly further and further and further?
Yep.
Okay. How would this help us in the future? I wonder how this might help us.
Well, maybe people have heard of the famous fighter plane in Britain called the Supermarine Spitfire. The Supermarine Company made high-powered, high-speed, single-engine aircraft, and the technology for that, they had these seaplane races in Europe, and the reason they did that is these planes needed really long runways to take off to get speed because they're high performance engines. It took a while to wind up, and then they would race these things to see which plane was the fastest. And the technology for the Supermarine Spitfire would come from these seaplane races. The other reasons why flying boats, you just mentioned the Clipper and all that, were so prevalent is prior to World War II, there was not as many long runways available for regular land-based aircraft. After World War II, there'd be a buttload of them, and that would spell that, and the helicopter would spell the demise of the flying boats. But yeah, Ryan, good point. At this period in the 30s, this was a really prevalent, common way to fly.
One last comment, and we'll move on to the next clip. But wasn't this plane also prone to explosions?
Not that I read.
I was thinking it was called the flying gas can for whatever reason, because I know that whenever Flight 19, the famous flight that disappeared in 1945 off the coast of Florida in the Bermuda Triangle. Well, they sent PBYs up to look for them, and they were saying that those PBYs disappeared too.
Oh, jeez. Okay.
Well, but they were concerned because those planes were prone to blowing up.
I have not read that in any of my research.
Okay.
But is it possible? I guess so. I mean, they had two engines. They had a lot of gas. The gas was in the wings. They had a flight engineer that actually sat up in the wing to help adjust air fuel mixture. Maybe that did happen, but my reading from the PBY is it was ridiculously reliable and
good.
And durable.
Maybe I misremember. I might be thinking of something else. So we'll just disregard that. We'll see. I don't want to disparage any awesome plane here. So.
No, the PBY was really one of the best, most important planes that we produced, and we're not just saying that because we got somebody that worked on PBYs. If our research said that this plane was a turd, we'd call it a turd. But my research showed that this aircraft was really badass. So at any rate, that's what he's doing. Right. He's working on his PBY base.
All right. So let's get into the meat of this interview here. Are we going to start getting into the events of December 7th next?
We are. I got two clips back to back, and he's going to start talking about December 7th, 1941.
All right, here we go.
Well, as I say, I was in the duty section, and the and I'd been assigned the 0800 to 1200 security watch. And whenever I was assigned something like that, I'd rather arrive 20 minutes early than to be 10 seconds late, you know. So I had came down early. I met up with the individual that was assigned the 0400 to 800 watch. He and I made the rounds around. Everything seemed to be normal. Everything was going on like another day on a peaceful Pacific Island paradise, you know, and everybody was getting themselves ready for that kind of a day. I heard the sound of an approaching aircraft, but that's not unusual because we're a naval air station. Airplanes come and go. Then all of a sudden, after I had made the rounds with the guide, I figured there was no need for me to do it again so soon. So I went up into an upper level office, the personnel office. I was trying to type a letter to my dear sweet mother using that 2-finger hunting peck system, if you know what I mean.
Oh, yeah.
I think prior to joining the Navy, I hadn't even seen a typewriter, much less used one.
Oh.
But I was making progress. I was proud of what I was doing. I heard the sound of approaching aircraft, but like I said, that's not unusual. Airplanes come and go. Then that sound that airplane changed, and I knew immediately that it was in a power dive. And I'm thinking, that must be one of our carriers, must be returning. The U.S. Lexington and the U.S. Enterprise had left the harbor sometime prior to that to deliver new short-range aircraft to our military forces on Midway and Wake Island. Mm-hmm. And I figured they must be coming back, and as usual, they will launch their aircraft while they're still out at sea, and those airplanes come in and operate off the land base while the carrier is in the harbor. The sound of that airplane changed. I knew it was in a power dive. And I'm thinking, oh boy, that's one of our. He's got a little bit bored with that regulation formation fly, and he's wanting to do a little hot dogging and have a little fun. I'm thinking, boy, oh boy, I wouldn't want to be in his shoes when the commanding officer gets a hold of him. Little did I realize it was those of us there on the ground and on the ships that were going to be in some serious, serious trouble very, very shortly. I think that morning there was approximately 110 named craft in the harbor at that time. What a target that was, huh? You know, and those pilots in those airplanes were good. They made the best use they could of them. Those battleships tied up side by side in a row and everything like that. You know, so it was a very disastrous, but at the same time, a very exciting morning for a 17-year-old sailor.
When that bomb fell from that Japanese plane and wounded you, were you in Hangar 54?
I had been inside the hangar, and I went out to see, and I heard all that wreck and stuff. I went out to see what was going on, and I had been in an upper level office, and then part of that bomb fragment stuff blasted in the back of my head. And then here comes another one of those airplanes. And when he pulls out of that power dive, I don't think he's more than 100, 150 feet over my head. I see that big round red insignia. So I knew right away who our visitors were.
So with the benefit of the other Veterans History Project interview that I watched from, 20 years ago, I want to add a few more details that weren't covered in this description. Number one, he was in Hangar 54. So really quick, he was on Ford Island, which sits right in the middle of the harbor. I'm looking at a map.
That's good to explain that because I don't know that he had covered that yet.
Yeah, he hasn't covered that yet. Ford Island it's a long gate. It's kind of rectangular. It's oriented kind of northeast, southwest. On the southern tip of that island is where Hangar 54 and several other ones, that's where the PBY seaplane base was located. Right across from them, right across the channel, were the dry docks where ships like the Shaw and the Pennsylvania were. Right? Those were going to get hit. The Shaw would literally get a magazine hit and blow up spectacularly. Most people, when they see this big white phosphorescence explosion from the picture of Pearl Harbor, they think that that's the USS Arizona. It's not. It's the USS Shaw blowing up. and he was right across the harbor from that. So that's the southern tip of the island. If you were to go north along the island, along the shore, he was just, a couple hundred yards away from Battleship Row. So he was literally in the bullseye in the center. As I look at a map on the southern tip of where he was in Hangar 54, across from him were the dry docks. Just to the left of him or to the northeast would have been Battleship Row. And on the island itself had an airfield. They called it Luke Field, but the Navy never called it that. It used to be an Army field. What the Navy did with that airfield is when the aircraft carriers would come into port, in the harbor, they wouldn't come in with the airplanes. The airplanes needed the ship to be moving. The ship's going 20 or 30 knots. They'd turn into the wind. The wind's going 20 or 30 knots. There's 30 to 60 knots of airspeed that you have before you even take off from the deck. So that helped these planes get the lift they needed to get the short takeoff. So when they came into harbor, the entire air group would fly, land on that island, and be stored there in hangars and be repaired and fixed. And they would train. And then when the ship went out to sea, it would leave without its air group. And then the air group would go and land on the plane or on the ship, I'm sorry. And they would go on their whatever they were doing for their cruise. So he's right in the middle of all of this.
I just want to say something real quick. It just popped in my head. Imagine if the aircraft carriers had been in Pearl Harbor that day.
Yeah.
Now, we just found out that it was customary for the aircraft to be launched ahead of time, and they come in, they land on Ford Island so that the aircraft carriers could be worked on without aircraft aboard.
Absolutely.
So even if they would have sunk the aircraft carriers, we still would have had, they might have wiped out a large number of planes, but think about it if the planes were on the aircraft carriers and if the aircraft carriers were in Pearl Harbor and they got sunk, it would be a far more, impactful outcome. So thank God that our aircraft carriers were out on maneuvers that day.
Totally. And what's interesting, and we learned this from an earlier interview, the carriers were resupplying, and of course, Chuck talked about too, were basically shuttling, ferrying aircraft to Midway Island. The only reason that the battleships were there that day is because they were too slow. They can only go about 20 knots. An aircraft carrier can go 30 knots. All of its supporting vessels, the cruisers, destroyers, can go 30 knots. And the battleships would have slowed them down. That's why they were there, and that's why the carriers were out doing that. I read somewhere that the aircraft carriers were supposed to be, you can't make this stuff up, Ron, you're going to love this, were supposed to be in Pearl Harbor on the day of the attack. Halsey was in charge of that task force, and a storm... Halsey's hurricanes, right? Well, so for people who don't know, Halsey's infamous for later in the war taking his carrier task force into a couple of hurricanes that really did a lot of damage to the fleet. Well, in this case, it was beneficial. A storm slowed their progress to Pearl Harbor, so they ended up coming to Pearl Harbor a day later than they were supposed to because of that damn storm, and that's the only reason those carriers weren't in there.
I've never heard that story. That's amazing.
I read it when I was doing research on Ford Island. I was like, why isn't that talked more about?
Oh my gosh. So Bull Halsey, man, that guy, he lived by the storm and died by the storm, didn't he?
So yeah, exactly. I mean, it cuts both ways, right? It
does cut both ways.
So at any rate, wow. And the other thing that I forgot to mention, an audience, you're gonna like this. So he's in Hangar 54. This is what he does not say that he says in the other interview. It's 7:55. That's when the Japanese attack, and they attack the ships and the airfields, including the seaplane base. It was very deliberate. I got some statistics for you on that later. When they were bombing all of the planes, all these PBYs, one of the bombs hit outside Hangar 54 while he was typing the letter, blew in the glass, and would wound him. And then he would run out. As he was running out, he had this half-written letter to his mom that on the top was December 7th, 1941, space. Hey, Mom, how are you doing? He said he didn't even think about it. He curled it up and threw it in the trash on his way out. And he said to this day, he wished he had kept that letter.
Oh, my gosh. Yeah. Can you imagine? That would be framed. That'd be in the Smithsonian.
Yeah, like just
honestly,
this little stamp of what was going on right when that occurred. And so you're going to hear him talk about his injuries later. He'll explain it in more detail than I would, but he was literally at ground zero. It wasn't an errant bomb. Where he was in the middle of the attack, and the Japanese had deliberate and intentional plans to neutralize that seaplane base. And we'll talk more about that later.
So did you witness the explosion of the USS Arizona?
Yes, yeah, the Arizona, yeah. Yeah, and then it not only it exploded, and then it burned for some time afterwards before they got all that fire out and everything. You just knew. I just knew, even though I was only 17 years old, I knew with every one of those bomb blasts and with every one of those aircraft that were diving and stuff like that, somebody was losing their life.
How close were you to the Arizona when it exploded?
Oh, quarter of a mile maybe, or less. Yeah, and there were other ships. What was it? The Pennsylvania that was in the dock right across the channel from us, and there was 2 destroyers in the dock also. I forget the names of them now. Anyway, when they exploded, you could not only feel the concussion, but the heat from them blasts.
My goodness. Was there pieces from the exploding ships like landing around the island?
Well, yeah, there were pieces of that stuff flying everywhere.
There are only 11 men alive who can explain to you what he just told you about where he was when that attack occurred. I mean, think about this guy is on foot on Ford Island. Okay. He's witnessed the Arizona blow up. You'll find out some other things that he witnessed here shortly, but he didn't mention this, but the USS West Virginia took several torpedoes that morning. Remember when we were at the Wings Over Houston Air Show and we had a bunch of Pearl Harbor survivors there? Mm-hmm. One of those guys, I can't recall his name right now, but he was on the West Virginia and they were hit like with several torpedoes, and he was considered dead. They actually sent a letter home to his family that he had died in the Pearl Harbor attack, only to find out later that no, he hadn't. He was in the hospital, so covered with oil because he was blown off the ship out into Pearl Harbor, where all of this fire was. The ocean, the water was on fire, fuel oil everywhere, but the guy survived. So anyway, long story short, there was complete mayhem going on around Chuck Kohler. I mean, all sides of the island. He was in the center of the fury. When you think, or when I think, I won't speak for you, when I think of the Pearl Harbor attack, it feels big and spacious to me. When you visit there and you realize it's not a very big harbor, it's not huge like you think it would be. I mean, it's a big harbor and the Navy uses and all that, but I mean, when I'm looking at this map of where he was in the southern tip of Ford Island, and he's just, the channel with several hundred yards wide, he's right across from the Shaw. The 2 other destroyers he was speaking of were the Cason and the Downs. They'd get hit. The Helena, the Ogallala, they got sunk. You got a picture in the dry docks of the USS New Orleans. We interviewed some people in New Orleans who were there. We know what they experienced. The Pennsylvania's there. And then he could have literally just walked along the island, a casual, leisurely stroll. He could have just looked to his left and he would have seen Battleship Row. I mean, I don't know if there's anyone could be any more well-placed to see most of the big things that happened than if you're right there on Ford Island. One thing I was going to mention real quick, if for anybody out there who has been to Ford Island, or if you haven't been yet, keep this in mind. Whenever you go from the mainland across that Navy pontoon bridge out to Ford Island, there's the very famous footage of the USS Arizona exploding, right? Everyone has seen it. It's been played ad nauseum for decades on TV, where there's a guy, you see him point up to the sky, and then right after that, you see the bomb hit and the Arizona exploding. Well, that camera angle was taken from a hospital ship, okay? That hospital ship was very nearly
where in the location where the bridge is today. So as you're going across that bridge toward Ford Island, you're getting at a certain moment along that bridge road, you're at the exact place where that camera footage was taken from. And you're looking at the same vantage point of the Arizona exploding as that guy would have on December 7th, 1941, when he used that camera.
And the name of the hospital ship was the Solace.
The Solace.
It's right there. And here's something else blowing my mind. Just to the north of that ship at Anchorage was the Phoenix. And that was the cruiser that would pick up Pete Konduras, who we featured several episodes ago. He would go on the Phoenix and be rescued and during one of his bombing missions. Unbelievable.
We've interviewed a guy from the USS Nevada that was at Pearl Harbor. Yep. We've interviewed a guy from the USS California.
Yep.
Right.
New Orleans.
And the New Orleans and Wish Lemons. Was he on the California?
He was on San Francisco.
San Francisco.
Yep.
So gosh, I mean, we've covered quite a few guys so far with respect to Pearl Harbor, and you can never learn enough about this.
No, and I'll add one more thing. In the video that's on the Veterans History Project, what they do with Chuck is they bring a map of Ford Island and they show him and they say, "Where were you? Tell us about this."
Perfect.
And he points to it. I'm going to extract that clip and make it available on our website when we drop this so people
Perfect.
can go see. I might even transpose some of it on an actual physical map with some X's so you can see Hangar 54. You can see some of the other places that he's going to talk about here in a minute. But anyway, we'll do that. We're going to move into now. So what does Chuck do? The Pearl Harbor's being attacked. His specific spot in Pearl Harbor is actually being physically bombed and destroyed, and we're going to talk more about that later.
He's been wounded?
He's been wounded by a bomb blast from a dive bomber. So what does he do? And these next two clips, we'll play them back to back. Here's what happens.
I was fortunate that I would, when they ordered us, the duty officer ordered us into an unfilled construction ditch. I recognized the the ordnanceman who takes care of all of the ammunition and the guns and stuff like that. I encouraged him to unlock the shack and let us get guns. And I was able to get a 50 caliber machine gun. I spent the rest of that morning firing on those attacking aircraft. Here's what I was using. You see that? That's a 50 caliber machine gun.
Could you raise it up a little bit higher? Now we can see it. That's a big bullet.
Well, I bet you would. Yeah. These are, if you need a conversational assistant to get your point across, if you're not happy with what they're doing, this will do it every time. Believe you me.
Oh gosh, sorry, I'm sleeping here.
You were so engrossed in the story. You're like, I got a clip to play.
You had the 50 caliber machine gun. Where was it mounted? Where were you when you were fighting back?
Well, the only mounts we had were in the waist blisters of the PBY patrol aircraft. So we had a limited field of fire because there was only so much. You had a good one down, but there's nobody below you. It's out up here, so it was kind of limited to where you could really get the firing at them.
So were these
target of some kind?
So were these machine guns already in the plane, or did you have to install them?
No, they weren't. They always, when the planes come in, those guns and ammo's taken off and put back under lock and key. So I recognized the ordnanceman. I asked him, you're the ordnanceman, yeah. You got a key for the ammo shack, yeah. Well, let's go get guns and ammos and shoot these blankety blanks, So that's where I got the machine gun. Got it into. It's a pretty heavy gun, So I was lucky that not only when I got that gun turned around to go out the door, there was a guy coming in the door that had figured maybe that they hadn't ought to be in that ditch either, I guess. And they'd followed us to the ammo shack, and he was somewhat taller, huskier built than I was. So I just offloaded that machine gun to him, tell him, take it to the PBY park in front of 23's hangar. I'll get the ammo. He looked a bit surprised, but he took a turn out the door. When I turned around and when I did that, ordnanceman was setting 2 canisters of 50 caliber ammo. I think there's about 50 rounds in each canister. I grabbed those 2 canisters and out the door I went. Now, never was fast on my feet, but I beat the guy with the gun in the airplane. We were approaching the airplane, the port side, but the ladder to get in the airplane was hanging from the starboard gun blister. I ran around backside and set those canisters down, started up the ladder. It dawned on me, if I get up inside this airplane, I was only 17 at the time, maybe 150 pounds, I guess. Am I going to be able to reach down and pull that big old gun up inside? I wasn't so sure of that, so I jumped down off the ladder just as the guy with the gun got there. Now, give it to me. You get up inside. I'll hand it to you. So he went chopped up the ladder, jumped inside, turned around, reached down. I got the gun to him somehow. I was supposed muzzle first, which is a safety no-no, but I don't think either one of us was thinking much about safety right at that time. Put it in the port blister. That's the side they're coming from. So he turned and disappeared into the fuselage of that airplane. I grabbed the canister of that ammo in my left hand, guided myself up the ladder with the right hand, set that canister inside, back down, got the second one back up, set that inside, jumped inside of the airplane myself, picked up those 2 canisters, turned and stepped across to the port gun blister just as he was swinging that mounted gun out and locking it in the firing position. I set the canisters down under the gun, flipped the lid open, go up with the end of the belt, ready to load, thinking he'd have the breech open. But he was just standing there staring skyward. I looked up, and here comes another one of those airplanes in a steep hard eye. Same old blinking, flashing lights, man. I couldn't wait on this other guy to get his train of thoughts back together. I just reached over, slid the lock forward, threw the breech open, fed the belt into the loading mechanism, slammed the breech shut, grabbed the charging pin, pulled it back and let it go. Bam! We got around the chamber. Shoot! I shouted. And he pulled the trigger.
I was going to have you play the next clip, but that articulation of getting a 50 caliber machine gun into action is beautiful. It's 100% correct. I'm not trying to say that he's wrong about things and whatnot. He was there. What I'm saying is that it's been a long time. People misremember things. That was not misremembered. That's him talking about trying to get in a position where he can fight back. I don't know about you, Ryan, but when he described getting that gun into action, I was getting goosebumps.
Oh, well, I don't know if you could tell in the video. I'm glad you don't have me on the screen from the interview, because I got teary-eyed listening to him, because at that moment, that guy was time traveling right then.
Yes.
He was explaining to you how it happened in his mind's eye, blow by blow. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the closest that we're ever going to get to time traveling back to that moment in Pearl Harbor. So when this guy right here is going back and explaining this in such vivid detail, it just blew me away.
It did. And so I was going to have you play the next clip, but we needed to stop there just to let. And if you can, in a lot of the apps,
to catch your breath, if anything,
to catch your breath, in a lot of the apps where you listen to our podcast, you can go backward in 10, 15, 30 seconds, rewind this back a couple of minutes and listen to that again, because if you close your eyes, you can see by the way he describes it, Chuck grabbing this big, huge, bossy anti-aircraft gun, the 50 caliber anti-material weapon. This isn't just a small machine gun. It's damn near a cannon, and putting it in the side blister of this PBY to fight back is unbelievable.
And obviously think of the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He said he never was a fast runner, but he beat the other guy there, totally. And he was not a big guy, and he was wondering how the heck he was going to get this ammo and gun up into the plane. And he somehow ends up doing it. These planes were, I'm sure to lift it up off the ground up into the fuselage was, 6-7 feet up, so this was one of my all-time favorite moments of all the interviews we've done, because he just nails it. And like I said, he travels back to that moment, and it's just automatic for him. It's seared into his memory.
Amen. Go ahead and play the next clip, Ryan.
I guess he was one of those guys that thought with a machine gun, you don't have to aim. You just point it in the general direction of the target and fire away. I stood there and watched those tracer bullets fly off harmlessly through empty space. And I got, we're going to get a better aim on that and that. So I said, let me get the next one. And he stepped aside and I grabbed that 50 caliber, got up. And when the next one come down, I fired at him. And when I started doing that, no more aircraft came back to bomb or to strafe our end of the island that morning. I think the guy that was in charge, the group leader, maybe told him, don't go back there anymore, because they didn't come back and do any more at our end of the island. I think that defensive fire that I put up there was the first to be put up on that end of the island. All the other guys were over there in the ditch.
Well, I just want to say something real quick. One of the things I really wish we would have asked him, did he see that he scored any hits at all on one plane? I mean, he doesn't have to have shot one down, but I wonder if he scored any hits at all.
You just took the words out of my mouth.
Sorry.
So no. You asked a question. I was wondering too. So if you go to the video from the Veterans History website, he talks about the planes coming in so close with the 50 cal, and he was one of the few people who got a weapon that could take down a plane into action. That he said that he could see these planes were coming in like at wave top level, the torpedo bombers. He could see bullets hitting the planes because of the tracer fire. He could see the planes flying into the tracer fire. Here's something else. He also mentions that there was a post-World War II report on a surviving Japanese pilot who took part in Pearl Harbor, and that pilot speaks to being part of the group that was shooting up that seaplane base, and that they started to take fire near the end of their bombing runs, and so they started to divert planes away from that area. And I've got one more thing that I just learned. I just learned this from Greg's Airplane. There were 88 seaplanes on that base that he was working on. On the day of the attack, 7 of them were up in the air doing flying boat stuff. There was one of these PBYs was sitting on the dock going for repairs. Every single PBY on that base was destroyed. Every single one of them except for the one PBY that he was in, firing back at the Japanese. The Japanese thought so highly of these scout planes being able to fly out after the attack and find their carriers where we could retaliate, that they wanted to make sure, Yamamoto wanted to make sure that every one of those was destroyed. And they destroyed every single PBY on that base except for the one that Chuck was firing at Japanese planes with, because it was being serviced on the tarmac.
This guy should have gotten the Medal of Honor for this sort of stuff. This is a hugely impactful thing that he did.
Dude, when I was listening to Greg's Airplanes, and just a few nights ago, and he said there was only one PBY that survived the attack, and it was getting serviced right there by the water on the ramp. I was like, holy crap. That's the frickin' PBY that Chuck was in.
Oh my gosh.
Because what else could it be? The rest of them were blown up or in the air. The only one left, the only one that survived, was the one that he was in, firing at Japanese with a 50 caliber machine gun.
I want to high five Chuck right now.
Amen.
What an amazing story. What a hero.
But you know what's crazy is he wasn't treated that way. Let's start playing the next clips, and we're going to find out a little bit of difference between peacetime leadership and wartime leadership. One would think that Chuck would be celebrated for his actions on December 7th, 1941, but as you're about to hear, or will hear next week, in the third installment of the Chuck Kohler series, you're going to hear some of the growing pains that occur when a nation goes from a peacetime footing to a wartime footing. So join us for that.
leaving that ditch, I was threatened, as I said, with military discipline for doing that. And I got bomb fragments, explosion debris, and window glass crashed into the back of my head when that very first bomb to fall. Well, he never did anything about it, because I think if he went up and tried to put me on report and the captain said, well, what did he do? Well, he disobeyed a direct order in time of battle. That at that time, that could get you an appointment with a firing squad. And I think, if he'd have said, well, you're going to put him on report for trying to defend the position and stuff like that. I think he decided against that right quick.
Tell him how you got injured. Explain how you were injured with the glass.
Well, yeah, the bomb fragments, and window glass and stuff like that, and blasting in the back of my head and stuff. And there was blood that covered my shoulder pads on my shirt, about halfway down or partway down the back of my shirt. I didn't do anything about it, because there were so many people that were so more severely injured and stuff than I was. And about, I think, the end of the second day, maybe the third day, I was coming through the hangar. I had been trying to avoid that officer that was threatened to put me on report. On about the second or third day, I was walking through the hangar, and this officer came in, and boy, I hide my face, like that. I'm trying to do something, so he wouldn't recognize me. I got past him, and I got back to the door. I was just about to go out, and I heard somebody shout, "Kohler!" I turned around, "Yes, sir." I said, "Come back here." So I went back there, and he laid his hand on my shoulder, kind of jerked me around like that, and feeling the back of my head, my shoulder pads, the shirt, my shirt was dried blood in the hair and stuff like that. He turned me around, and with a little more compassion in his voice, he said, "What the hell happened to you?" I said, "Well, sir, I was in an upper level office when that first bomb exploded, and some of that bomb fragments, explosion debris, window glass, whatever it is, I'm still wearing it." He said, "Have you been to," started to say hospital, and he realized there was no hospital on Ford Island. There's just a sick bay, what they call a sick bay. And he said, have you been to the sick bay? I said, "No, sir. They're far too busy with people that are far more seriously wounded than I am. I'm a farm boy. We just get up and lick our wounds and go on." He said, "You get your ass up to the hospital right now, and don't you disobey this order."
Ooh, so there's wartime and peacetime leadership, and in any book that I've read where they cover the entirety of the war, like how the Americans had to adapt to warfare in Europe or the Pacific, there's always this transition, the sort of things that war or peacetime officers are rewarded for can be very different than what you want from a wartime officer. And like Patton was criticized for after World War II. He basically said, "I have no place in this army, no place in this war, no place in this world, because the war is over and that's what I'm built for." And this officer that he speaks to that told him and all the men to stay in the ditch, he probably thought he was doing the right thing. He probably thought, "Hey, I'm trying to keep my men safe." But it's a completely different thing when you start to chastise the person who violated that order trying to defend the airbase.
I just want to recap real quick, because I'm not sure that it was conveyed very well to our listeners. A lot of times when we take these interviews, we try to place them in the correct order.
For the injury?
Not the injury, but exactly what happened. So whenever the attack started, right?
Yep.
He's writing a letter.
Yep.
He gets injured. He goes downstairs. The commanding officer, this guy,
Yep.
says, "All you guys get in this ditch and take cover."
Yep.
I don't know that he fully explained it. There's bits and pieces of what happened there, but I want to just kind of recap so everybody kind of knows what happened here. And at that point, Chuck's like, "The heck with that. I'm not sitting in this ditch. I'm going to fight back." And that's when he ran into the hangar and had told the guy to open the ammo storage and get the gun out and did his action. Okay. So that's what happened here in a short recap. And that's why he was trying to avoid the captain after that, because he knew he could get reprimanded. He could actually get shot. He could face a firing squad for that offense. Now, would you do that? That's what he's kind of getting at now. So go ahead, Tony.
No, I was going to say, you just set up the next clip beautifully. I have nothing to add. Go ahead and play it.
Well, I looked at those guys. It was that ran and stayed hid in that ditch that morning as a bunch of cowards, because that's what they were to me. I was laying my life on the line, and they were doing everything they could to avoid it. And so, but I came to realize then later that they were doing what that duty officer ordered them to do. So they were following orders. It was the duty officer that was the coward. That's the way I ended up feeling. Here I am, a 17-year-old kid trying to set up the defense while the duty officer is cowering there in that ditch.
And threatening you with disciplinary action on top of it.
Well, I think he must have really, maybe, well, in fact, he was going to put me on report, and our commanding officer was a Lieutenant Commander Winters, if I remember right. And he maybe, well, what was he doing that you want to put him on report for? Well, he left that ditch and got a 50 caliber machine gun and was firing on those attacking aircraft. And you're going to put him on report for that? Young man, wait outside the door. We'll call you back in if we need you. He must have told him, what the hell's the matter with you? What was your brain? If that gets out to the newspapers, and it surely will, that this kid, 17-year-old kid, is trying to set up the defense, and you're going to put him on report for doing that? It went over very good for him. Anyway, nothing ever, I never heard any more about it.
That there are stories about the attack on Pearl Harbor, and a majority of the stories you hear are acts of individual heroism.
Yeah.
And this is one of them. Anyway, I think he gets into, why he thinks he didn't get any recognition for this, I think, coming up. But these were guys doing what came instinctively to them, which was to fight back. Get up out of that ditch, go grab something. I don't care if it's rocks or whatever. Start fighting back. So anyway,
no, agree 100%.
My diatribe.
No, it's completely legit. And I don't know if I played. There was some comments that he made about commendations. I didn't put it in here, but I'll summarize it. He should have gotten a Purple Heart. He should have gotten something equivalent to at least a Silver Star. He was never recognized for any of this. And a lot of it, I think, has to do with the fact that there was, to be recognized by that duty officer would have made the duty officer look bad. So it falls into human psychology and politics more than recognizing someone objectively for a heroic action, quite frankly. Yeah. So we are going to continue to talk about Pearl Harbor, because what we always do is try to get as much information, money as memories, any little piece of whatever we can get, right? I mean, there's not a lot of these guys left, and we're on the phone.
This is your chance. You got them on the line. You got to talk to them and ask them everything you can.
So we're going to play a few more clips of just some random questions that we asked them.
So I have to ask you, did you witness any other ships being hit or sunk while you were fighting the Japanese on Ford Island?
Oh, yeah. You see the USS Oklahoma. Yeah. Capsized. And those guys were trapped in there, and they would be banging on the hull with a wrench or a hammer, whatever they could get. And they're out there cutting holes, trying to get down to them to rescue them. Of course, they got to some, but they were, unfortunately, they weren't able to get to all of them,
Did you have
with this one guy? They were able. Some of them were able to get through the portholes, there on the side of the ship. But he was a heavy-set individual. He knew that he would not be able to get out of that ship, but he helped the other guys get out, knowing that he would never make it himself, but he wanted to make sure that he got as many guys out as he could. So things like that happened there.
When the attack was over and the fires are raging and the ships are capsizing, I mean, what were you thinking? What were your thoughts?
Well, you know, you knew then that you were at the war. This wasn't a one-day thing. This was going to be an extended thing. So you prepared yourself as best you could. I learned there never, from that day on for a while, you're a part of the crew, but you don't want to get too close. You know, and they deep friendships, because here today, gone tomorrow, you know. So it was best not to build a real deep friendship. Things like that happen.
Did they ask you to help find bodies or take care of wounded men from the attack?
Well, we just had to, it might not be your particular job, but if it's something that needs to be done, do it. Get it done. Everybody was working for the same goal, to get everything stabilized as best we could, get back to as normal a life as is possible that you can do under those conditions. You never really knew when it might happen again.
We're going to have the entire uncut interview on our website when we drop this. These are selected clips from it. And one of the things that he talks about in some detail, because one of the things we were asking is, okay, the attack's over. What the heck happens then? What's going on? Because we don't get a chance to talk to somebody who was there. And here are some of the things that he mentioned. On Ford Island, he said all these soldiers are getting fished out of the water, and many of them were injured, burned, pieces blown off them. And he was in these hangars. They were living there, right? They had their bunks, their beds, everything was in these hangars. They were asked to take all of the mattresses off their beds and lay them in the hangars, and that turned into a makeshift medical facility. And he said they didn't have a place to sleep because, the mattresses were being used by the wounded, and there was no other bed, so they just crashed wherever they could. He said food became a problem. A lot of these men were getting their food from the ships, from the galleys. Yeah. Well, these ships were sunk, turned upside down, blown up. And the limited amount of food that was available on the base that weren't in these ships, it was difficult for the first week or so to get it sent to the right people. So they had to go on rations where they couldn't eat as much. And there was those sort of things is what we encourage our audience to go ahead and listen to the whole thing, because there's elements of this that I can't really include in here, but they're there, and it's really fascinating to listen to. And in fact, our next clip, and we don't need to get to it yet, Ryan, if you have some comments, we're going to talk more about some of the things he was doing after the attack. But do you have any comments before we move to the next clip?
No, I'm ready to move on. I think you said everything I would have on my mind and everything. It's just, I'm just still trying to process a lot of this stuff,
Totally. So now he's going to talk about the post-attack work and some of the things. Let's play these next two clips back to back, Ryan, because it really speaks to some of the crazy stuff that was going on the island at this time.
Well, we were so busy trying to salvage what we could, A lot of those airplanes were burning. We were trying to move the ones that were still, that we could, trying to move them away from the ones that were burning and stuff like that, to save what we could, salvage what we could out of that mess. And some of them were so bad that we knew there was nothing they could do for them. Somebody showed up with a dozer, one of those Caterpillars, and the aircraft that were banged up to a point where they didn't figure they could do much with them. One of the chief petty officers must have been the one who decided which one. They just pushed them over into big piles, get them out of the way, and then as we got a chance, then we tried to get rid of all that stuff. I think during the war there, if an airplane come in, and it was shot up to a point where we could cannibalize what we could from it, and then we would load it on a barge and just take it out into the deep water and push it over the side, get it out of the way.
When did you feel, was there a concern that the Japanese were going to come back and attack again after the Pearl Harbor bombings?
Well, we immediately thought that they would come back with landing parties, because it would have been they could have taken over the island. And so we were setting up sandbag machine gun placements, and the welders at that time were in there welding up stands for a 50 caliber machine gun. If you just put it on a stand and start firing it, it'll push you over and turn over itself. So they had to build it in such a way that we could put sandbags around the legs of those, so that would hold the mount down while you were firing the machine gun. So by the end of the day, we had machine gun nests all over the island, that Ford Island there, and we'd be signed a 4 hour on and 4 hour off. And you'd go from one machine gun maybe to this one over here, that one over there. But we were ready to go if they came back.
I just want to jump in real quick before we play the next clip, make an observation. He's talking about that. It reminds me of the Gerard Daly series we did, where he was on a coastal battery on the West Coast, and he witnessed that Japanese sub sail by, and his commanding officer told him not to fire on it. They thought it was a U.S. destroyer or something. It's so huge. But my point is just that, those events, Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, it was like January of 42 and February of 42 when the Japanese were actually shelling the West Coast of the U.S. with submarines and bombing them with they had these gigantic submarines there they could launch airplanes from. Think about that.
Yeah.
They had the largest submarines of the war. And that was the high watermark for the Japanese. Think about that right there, that short period was really up until probably midway, June of 42, was the high watermark for the Japanese.
Yes.
December 7th to June of 42.
Yeah, because at the same time, they were invading and conquering the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies and Singapore. Something else he mentioned was the bulldozer, having to bulldoze the planes, move them out of the way. He's speaking to those 81 planes, 80 that were destroyed. And that a lot of them, they basically are trying to pull parts off all these destroyed planes that were bombed and strafed by the Japanese, which prevented us from being able to go out effectively with our best long-range search aircraft and find out where the hell the Japanese carriers were. We were never able to determine that. And a lot of it had to do with Yamamoto intentional targeting of that base, in addition to the battleships and the carriers and the air bases. Those seaplanes were very important, or I should say flying boats, to destroy. And that's what they were doing. The other thing I thought of, they got the dozer on all the stuff and they were burying it. I've watched a documentary on the USS Arizona where pieces of the foremasts were brought onto Ford Island and just overgrown. And somebody went there and they're like, there it is. It's still sitting there. You can go there this day and see pieces of the USS Arizona that they chopped off. Could you imagine metal detecting there?
Oh, no.
Could you imagine how much fun that would be? The stuff you would find from everything being buried and bulldozed and moved and shifted around after that attack. It would be, could you imagine what the harbor floor contains after all these years of it being a naval base and being attacked in Pearl Harbor?
I can't imagine that. I know that there was an explosion that happened during World War II in Pearl Harbor, like I think 1944 or something like that. And they ended up bulldozing, taking all that stuff over into like a cove of Pearl Harbor. Right. And to this day, it's just a big cove full of burned up junk from the war.
It's just a giant Superfund site with a Navy base there.
Hey, one thing real quick. Yeah. He mentions all these PBYs that were actually airborne during the attack.
7.
Why weren't those 7 planes redirected to go out and follow the damn Japs?
Maybe they didn't have enough fuel. Maybe they were already on the return leg. Maybe they were in the wrong direction. Maybe they were flying east. My answer to your question is I do not know. What I do know from the primary sources cited by Greg's airplanes is there were 7 planes in the air. None of those effectively were able to find the Japanese fleet. And the only one that was left on Pearl Harbor after the attack was the one that Chuck was using.
That our guest of honor is talking about.
100%.
That's amazing. And sorry, I mean, some people think using the word Japs is derogatory. I'm just talking in World War II parlance here, But I mean, I get excited about this. It was like, why didn't we go after these guys? We had 7 planes up in the air that could have followed them back out. You're right. Maybe they were headed to the West Coast. Maybe they were, I don't know. But that's a mystery to me. I would love to know why there wasn't a pursuit that happened.
Yeah, and there wasn't. The only thing that came close to it was Halsey's aircraft carriers coming in. They launched scout planes looking for them, but they couldn't find him. It was probably a good thing, to be honest with you, because I think at that point in the war, the Japanese would have just sunk our aircraft carriers. So, so we have one more clip. This is our last clip on Pearl Harbor, at least in sequence. We'll have a few more interesting ones at the very end, but this is kind of what were his thoughts when it was all over.
How soon after the attack did you understand how much damage was done?
Well, like you said before, the winds of war had been blowing. We were expecting something to happen, but not there. They expected it to happen like down, in the South Pacific Island somewhere else, but not at Pearl. Anyway, and so it was a surprise that they came in the way they did and stuff like that. But I've heard people, they've talked about in history and stuff like that about that being such a great plan that they had. All they were following exactly the military does training exercise ever so often. And that was one of the ways that they have a red fleet and a blue fleet. And that was one of the ways that they had used before. And that fleet that came in from the north like they did, that won the war games. And so that's the Japanese were following exactly a pattern that the U.S. had set years and years before in a training exercise.
Could you share with us, when you think back on the attack on Pearl Harbor, what sort of things stick out the most? What do you remember the most after all this time?
Well, those pilots were good. They knew what they were doing, and they did an excellent job of it. I hadn't, America at that time, and I think we're kind of losing ground now, but you just had to, even though you might have a dislike because they're trying to kill you, you had to admire the way they were doing it, because they were doing a good job.
You've heard that before, haven't you, Ryan?
Yeah, for sure.
Like we were talking about the kamikazes and the grudging respect that some of our servicemen have for someone entirely committed to winning the war, including voluntarily and openly sacrificing their lives. I don't think it's a state secret. I don't think what I'm about to say is controversial. If it is, we have a website, warriornextdoor.com, and our Facebook page. Tell me that I'm wrong. I think the best trained carrier air crews in the world at this time would have been the Japanese Navy Air Force.
Sure. Yeah, I would say so. I mean, the next obvious one would be obviously the British.
Yep.
Potentially.
Yep.
But the aircraft carriers off of the airplanes off of the British aircraft carriers, the British fleet weren't being widely used at that point yet. Now, I mean, obviously they took out ships like the Bismarck and everything, but that was widely a naval battle that, anyway, that's a whole nother story.
I agree with you. I think the British were probably number 2. Their equipment wasn't as good. Their planes weren't as good, but their tactics were phenomenal. Their night fighting was phenomenal. But I think if you look at like equipment, capability, training, it was the Japanese. It was not the United States. I'd argue I'd argue the United States didn't become the best carrier air force until probably mid to late 1943.
I think that's fair.
I think it took that long for us to have a bunch of battles and lose them and learn a bunch of stuff and have new tactics and bring in the Hellcats before we could say we're the best. And then from that point forward, we haven't relinquished it.
Yeah, and I would say the Hellcat was the F6F was definitely a game changer, and that helped us, become, as successful as we were. So.
Totally. And so now we're going to switch gears. We're going to play a couple clips in a row that's going to talk about some of the things he did after Pearl Harbor until he got his next assignment. And then we're going to stop and spend a little time on that.
Well, I stayed there at Pearl, and I became a crew leader, a metalsmith. Whenever we had metalsmith work to do, eventually became an inspector. They'd come in, and if the pilot turned in a gripe sheet that there was something wrong with the aircraft, I'd have to go out and check it out, determine what needed to be done, how it needed to be done, and then go check it out after it was done to make sure it was done right, the way it should be. And they kept me doing that there. We stayed there at Pearl Harbor until I think it was about May of 42. And they brought the aircraft carriers from the East Coast and stuff out there because they saw that that's where the problem was going to be if we had another one. So they needed areas. The carriers could come into Pearl Harbor, and the harbor had been dredged deep enough, and that's where Ford Island in the center of the harbor come from. It's the dredging material from when they deepened the channel, so the battleships and stuff would come in.
Wow!
They sent all the patrol plane squadrons over to Kaneohe Bay. It's on the other side of the island. It has shallower water, so the ships couldn't operate in there, the big ships. But the PBYs and stuff, those flying boats, they could operate off of it. So they sent all of the patrol squadrons over to Kaneohe Bay. And we stayed there then until the Navy came up with a deal that you do 20 months overseas, and then you could try to rotate you back to the U.S. for an equal amount of time. I came back to the U.S. and they sent me to Alameda Naval Air Station right here, close to where I am now. And when I got there, those people there were so involved in, I called it brown nosing a smoochio, you know what I mean?
Okay.
And they would do anything to keep from being sent overseas, it just made me almost ill to watch what they would do, So I went up and asked them to send me back out into the Pacific. I told them, I said, I'd rather be out there with the Japanese than here with you guys, So boy, of any and all requests I ever made while I was in the Navy, that one got the fastest result. And the next day I was on an order to go out. I ended up back waiting ashore at Majuro Atoll in the Marshall Islands on February 3rd of 1944. And I stayed out there then for I stayed out there until I think it was October of 45.
Be careful what you ask for, because they just sent him to the Majuro Atoll. And if you don't know where that is, that's okay.
I don't know where that is.
It is in the middle of nowhere. It is south of Wake Island, of all places.
Oh my gosh.
And Wake Island's in the middle of freaking nowhere. And it was one of a couple of these atolls that we would occupy and turn into forward operating bases. So you could, maintain your forces closer to the front lines. If things got damaged, you can fix them there. It would later be superseded by Ulithi Atoll, which we've spoken about in several other series. Later in 44, that would be like home base Alpha. But until then, the naval base on Majuro Atoll was captured during the raid and the capture of the island of Kwajalein. Basically, when that ended, Shortly thereafter, on February 3rd of 44, around the time when Chuck's going to be sent out there, they went and captured this airfield in this atoll. It was abandoned. It had a wooden pier and like a relatively, a 5,800-foot runway, which the Navy Seabees extended. And this atoll would be a seaplane base almost to the end of the war. It also was a submarine base, a destroyer base. It was tough living, to be honest with you. And in the next clip or two, he's going to talk more about the living conditions at this place that he said he wanted to go to because he thought stateside sucked. So clearly Chuck wasn't entirely cut out for working in the rear echelon areas, and he would soon find himself back in a forward operating position in a little-known place called the Majuro Atoll. Join us next week for those experiences and more. Oh, the war in the Pacific is not finished with Chuck Kohler yet. Join us in this fourth and final episode of the Chuck Kohler series. We're going to learn a lot more about what he did after Pearl Harbor, about the Majuro Atoll, about supporting one of the more storied air wings in the Pacific War, one of the most effective hunter-killer airplanes in the entire Pacific, and so much more. Thanks for sticking around, and enjoy this last episode with Chuck Kohler.
At first, we just had pup tents, if you know what they are. They're just a shelter from the rain and stuff. You're laying right there on the ground and everything. Then they came in and they built up a deck, a wooden deck, and then put up framework on the side and stretched one of those Army, I think they were 14 feet or 16 feet by 16 feet, Army tents over it. So then we had a floor. We had a wooden locker where we kept our belongings and stuff like that. So it became considerably more comfortable than what it was when we first got there.
So I'd like to talk about Majuro Atoll. I would like to hear you tell us more about what you were doing there. What was your job?
Well, I was still, I think by then they had changed me from a crew leader to an inspector. Like I said, I'd go out and check it out and recommend what had to be done, make a diagram of, if it was a patch, make a diagram of how it had to be repaired, the number of rivets, the size of the rivets, a lot of things like that, and then I would have to go back later and make sure it was done the way it was supposed to be done.
What type of aircraft were you working on?
At that time, the PBY flying boats were our main aircraft.
I've read that some of the PBYs would go on night patrol and attack Japanese shipping. Did you have a chance to see any of those PBYs?
Yeah, they were the night raiders. Yeah, they were painted black, so you could see no lights or anything when they fly. They became a very efficient at what they were doing, and they could fly real low and come in and be below any kind of. They were beginning to experiment with radar and stuff like that at that time, so they would come in real low below the bands and stuff like that. I've talked to some of those guys that were crew members, pilots and stuff on those aircraft as I would do repair on and stuff like that. They were called the Black Cats.
Yes, and they were very effective.
It was exciting for a 17-year-old kid.
We need to talk about this. audience, if you haven't heard of the Black Cats, you need to know, because what those PBYs did during this crucial phase of World War II, when we were starting to go on the offensive, mostly in the Solomons and Guadalcanal, and then all the way through the rest of the war, was amazing. What they did, and a couple of the squadrons were flying off of Majuro Atoll, is initially they were painted with a mixture of soap and lamp black just to make them black. And they couldn't get like flat black paint up in Majuro Atoll earlier in the war. Later on, they became so effective that the Navy would formalize the Black Cats, and they would be painted flat black at the factory and delivered to them.
Awesome.
Yes, it is awesome. It is awesome. And these things could, like I said earlier, could carry 4,000 pounds of bombs and mines and depth charges. They sank submarines. They just wreaked hell on the Japanese. Typically, the Black Cats would drop bombs with a 5-second delay onto their target. So, because what they learned early in the war, they put Norden bomb sights on these Catalinas and tried doing like typical high-level bombing raids, like at 15,000 feet, and that never worked. They're not fast or maneuverable at 15,000 feet, and by the time the bombs would drop, the ships had plenty of time to move out of the way. And so, almost by accident, they learned if you fly in low and slow, you would think you're going to get shot out of the sky, but as long as you've got air superiority, as long as your Hellcats that came in 43 have wiped the skies clear of Japanese Zeros, you can do some stuff. So the daytime raids were owned by the Avengers and the carrier fleets. The nighttime was owned by the Black Cats. And so the Japanese were so afraid of the American carrier forces that often they would move freight and cargo and even some of their warships at night. And so what these Black Cats would do is they drop a bomb with a 5-second delayed fuse so it wouldn't blow up their own airplane because they were flying low. And then they would also deploy illuminating flares to hinder the enemy's guns response. These flares would blind the Japanese defenses, which would increase the Cats' chances of escaping. Afterwards, you can't make this stuff up, the gunners of the Catalina would fire upon the targets as the aircraft strafed the enemy. To instill further fear and psychological panic in the Japanese, the crew would drop empty beer bottles and Coke bottles, which created a haunting, screeching sound in the middle of the night. The Japanese started losing ships so fast, so regularly, that they thought that the Americans had developed a secret airplane that they didn't know about. And instead, it was a flying freaking boat painted black. That was the secret weapon.
Well, can you imagine the guys sitting around thinking of this PSYOPs stuff?
Yes.
Like, hey, you know what we ought to do?
Yes.
They're all sitting around drinking beer, and they see their big pile of the bottles of beer, and they're like, what if we dropped all these out? Oh my
yes,
gosh.
because they'd make a whistling sound as the wind blew past the opening in the mouth. And so they would drop these things, they would as they came by. Unbelievable. How effective were they? These stats come from the National World War II Museum. For all I know, this was written by Corey Graff, who we had on our show recently. Here's what it states. VP-11, which is one of the units, became the first patrol squadron in history. The first patrol squadron in history to earn a presidential unit citation.
Wow.
After they reportedly sank, this is just one squadron, VP-11, they reportedly sank 75,000 tons of shipping, which included a cruiser, a destroyer, a fleet tanker, smaller warships, and a freighter. That was just in 1943. Later, VPB-52 sank 34,000 tons of merchant shipping and 10,000 more tons of enemy shipping, in addition to 2 submarines. Overall, it is estimated that the Black Cat missions contributed to the sinking of roughly 2.8 million freaking tons of Japanese naval and merchant shipping. And the only reason they were disbanded in 1945 is because they ran out of shit to sink. That is it. There was nothing left. And they're like, we go on patrols, we don't see anything, and they were done.
So I don't think I remember him talking about the Black Cat stuff during the interview. Obviously, I must have been trying to think of something else to say, but I honestly didn't know that the PBYs, the Catalinas, had this type of service record. I figured they were just submarine patrols. You know, they go up and they fly around. They would do that sort of thing. They'd radio back to somebody. Maybe they'd drop some depth charges and things like that. I had no idea they were this lethal, and they were used to this effect during the war. I mean, I learned something every time we do these series, whether or not it's from the veteran or from our research and everything. And this is something I just never really realized happened before.
If you think I do this before that, you're wrong. I heard of the Black Cats, oddly enough, from a video game called Call of Duty. They actually have a map where you're flying in a Black Cat, shooting at Japanese ships, and then picking up wounded airmen. And in fact, here's something else. Those missions where they would pick up wounded airmen were called Dumbo missions. And here's what one of the Catalinas did. This story, not the story, but what happened may be familiar to some people. The men who served on the Dumbos helped in recovering sailors and airmen. This is from the same source, the National World War II Museum. From recovering sailors and airmen from sunken ships, particularly in the Pacific Theater. The 56-man crew of the unfortunate USS Indianapolis, which had been sunk by a Japanese submarine, was rescued from shark-infested waters by a PBY. What they did, this PBY came in, saw the men were getting attacked by sharks because there was pieces of people. They landed. A PBY cannot carry 56 men. So they put as many men as they could on board. The healthier ones, you can't make this shit up. The healthier ones, they literally took paracord and tied them to the plane, tied them to the wings, tied them to the fuselage, and then floated to keep them out of the water in 12-foot waves. So there wasn't just this idyllic little pond that they were floating on. There was choppy water, and that's why they had to strap these men to the outside of the ship until boats could come in and pick those men up from the PBY. They were unstrapped from the PBY, loaded on the boats, and then the PBY could fly away. It's credited with saving those 56 men by doing that.
Oh, my God. I did not know that they did that. I had read somewhere that a PBY had rescued them, but I did not know that they had to go to that drastic of, efforts to actually be able to save all those guys. You'd think they'd be able to fit them all on the plane, but not if it held 4,000 pounds of bombs.
Yeah.
I mean, 56 guys all weighing at least 150 each. You're looking at 7,000 pounds or so right there. Wow. That's crazy.
This is why we do this. We could just play the clips and say, wasn't that interesting? But every one of these clips generally has something in there that's like, what, we need to talk about that. And this is one of the things I want to make sure people knew.
Remember the Cobra pilot from Vietnam?
Yes.
That you interviewed?
Yeah, Jim.
And he talked about there being the low flying helicopters that were basically the bait to bring out the Viet Cong or whoever, the NVA, to shoot at them. Then the Cobra would be lying in wait to take out whoever comes along. Well, remember they actually shot down a couple of those little choppers, and they picked these guys up, and there was no room to haul anybody.
Nope.
But they would let them ride on the gear,
on the skids.
Gear, on the skids.
They would just say, hang on, and off they went.
Oh my gosh. Okay, man, to be young and to be fearless, huh?
Yeah, the war is not an old man's game. And so there's more about Majuro Atoll that I was not aware of, and he's going to talk more about his time there because it was a really important forward operating base.
So I have to ask, did you ever get offered the chance to go on a mission? Did you ever want to go on a mission?
Yes, I would sign up on the list. Sometime the crew member would be sick or something like that, and we maybe weren't trained to do all of the crew members' jobs, but to do what we could, we could always be an observer, and we could be a gunner. So I would sign up for that, and whenever they found out that one of the crew members couldn't make it or suddenly felt ill or something like that, they would go down that list. You get on board and you're part of the crew.
What was that like? What was it like flying in a PBY in a war zone?
And you obviously had gunner experience.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, it was, we could move about in the plane. Some of the guys would be sleeping, the crew members, stuff like that. Because, like I say, you could stay out about 12 hours or something like that. And so they would alternate as pilot, co-pilot, whatever, gunner, observer. You remember the old PBY had a little tower between the fuselage and the wing, and that was to get those engines up so they'd be above the splatter of the water. And that engineer, they would set in that tower up there, and the pilot would tell him when he needed full power and what he needed and stuff like that. So they didn't have all of the immediate at hand control. A lot of that was being done. What am I talking about? The manifold pressure and all that stuff were controlled by that engineer sitting up there in that little tower.
Wow. So it was more like a ship than an airplane.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it was, the pilots are flying and stuff like that, but they're not controlling everything. They communicate with this guy up in the tower, and he communicates whatever they have to do, and you had the radioman aboard who was trying to keep in contact with other aircraft and whatever and stuff like that. So it was a very closely knit deal, and everything had to fit together well to keep everything going right.
Wow. I loved your question. So did you ever fly on a PBY or ever want to? I mean, because if you didn't, I understand. You're on the base, you're patching up like damage, the people shooting at the black cats.
I figured based upon Chuck's persona, he wanted to get in the fight. Obviously that guy, like he said, being an independent person has served him well his entire life. And his intrepidness, I figured was not going to be squashed as he was, land bound, on Majuro Atoll.
Yeah. The other thing that's funny, I could just see this green crew coming in stateside, and, Chuck decides, hey, I'll do a ride along. I'll go and take the port side machine gun blister. And I could see this kid's like, well, sir, do you know how to, shoot the gun and load it and, how to lead everything? And I could see Chuck look at him, it's like, kid, hold my beer.
Hold my beer. Right. See this glass falling out of the back of my neck? That's from Pearl Harbor, buddy.
I was shooting at Japanese planes out of these things before you even knew what Pearl Harbor was.
Right. You were making paper airplanes and I was shooting at them.
Yeah.
So.
And then lastly, really quick, as I said earlier, this was a flying boat. They literally called the things between the different sections of the ship bulkheads. They had watertight doors. And one other thing I learned from Greg's Airplanes is that the flight engineer that was in the wing monitoring the engines and air fuel mixture and manifold pressure, he states that may have been the earliest plane in the United States inventory that had what they called the flight engineer.
Oh, yeah.
Later in the war, the B-29s and other planes and commercial airlines all the way through the early 2000s would have, oftentimes the larger ones, a flight engineer. But prior to the PBY, that was not a position. And he thinks his research shows that the PBY was the first airplane in the United States inventory to have that position.
Ah, okay.
All right.
It makes total sense. It sounds like obviously it took more than one guy to fly it. So,
it sure did.
I mean, pretty crazy.
And so now we're still gonna talk a bit about Majuro Atoll. Here's another event that I think that a lot of people are not aware of.
Was the Majuro Atoll ever attacked by the Japanese?
No. I kind of think we were expecting troops to be on the island when we landed. We came in an LCI and they let those ladders down on the side and you run down, they run it up into the sand and you run down those ladders and go ashore. But there was no resistance. They had found out that we were coming on the way and they had abandoned the island. Marshall Islands, there's two chains of them, the east and the west. And we were on the one train, and they had a garrison over at what was they called it Ailing Lap Lap, AILINGLAP, Ailing Lap Lap. They were there, and we were over here. And at low tide, you could see the top of the palm trees over on that island. So we were that close.
Wow.
And one of my, they kicked the crap out of us there at Ford Island. And so I was involved in what got us started the war. And I was in a group that went aboard a LSI, and we went over to that other Ailing Lap Lap and lowered the Japanese flag and raised the Stars and Stripes. That was closure for me. I was a part of that group. And so we marched ashore. We had our rifles, slung over our shoulder. But we didn't have any ammo in the magazine or anything. They wouldn't let us have that because they figured somebody would start. But when we marched ashore there, they could have had their own troops up in the palm trees, like was one of their tricks and stuff, and they could have wiped us all out. So the guy that done that, Commander Noble was his name. He was in charge of there on Majuro Atoll. I think the only reason he done that is he wanted a Japanese flag, as a souvenir.
Wow. What's a hell of a story. Okay, let's unpack this a bit. So first off, for our audience, let's reinforce something. He didn't just land on Majuro Atoll with a fully completed airstrip and, okay, here you go. You already heard him say that they were living in pup tents. You just heard him tell you how they were delivered there, where they were landed there on LCIs. They basically invaded the island. And that's what my research shows, is they weren't sure if there's any Japanese on the island. So this contingent invaded the island. Fortunately, there were no Japanese on it, and they took control of the air base, and then the conditions got better over time. So this dude kind of did an amphibious landing. And then later in the war, this Commander Noble's like, you know what? I'm tired of looking at that Japanese flag flying over there. Had another invasion, but they wouldn't let the squids, that's what people derogatorily called Navy men, squids. They wouldn't let the squids have ammo in their gun. It reminds me, if anyone's seen the movie Sicario.
Yeah, great movie.
Great movie. And there's really two groups in that movie. There's these really sophisticated, like Delta, like elite SEAL team operators, right? And then there's these FBI agents that the Delta team people don't trust at all. And they're about to go in this tunnel, and he looks at the FBI guys. He's like, keep your gun on safety. Keep it pointed down. I don't want you shooting any of my men. And that's kind of why they didn't let the squids have ammo in their gun, because they felt like, you know what? We're more likely to shoot ourselves than the Japanese over there.
Yeah. You don't want to have losses that are only associated with your side of the coin,
Totally.
So.
I mean, can you bet? We lost 3 men invading the island. Well, how many Japanese were there? There wasn't any Japanese on the island, but there was a flag that I wanted.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, just wanted to unpack that a bit, because that's between the lines what happened there.
Yeah, and I've never heard of Majuro Atoll. I mean, before talking with Chuck, I've never heard of this place.
Nope.
I was just doing some research, looking it up on Google Earth and everything. I'm looking at the place where he's talking about this lap sort of place.
Lap.
And he spelled the whole thing out. I'm like, I can't even spell crayon. How the hell does he spell all that stuff like that at 102 years old? Oh,
he's awesome.
He is awesome.
All right. So now on the next clip, we're going to talk about VJ Day, because this was his last kind of assignment before the war ended.
I had extended my enlistment for 2 years to go to that deal, to get back to the States, to go back to the University of Oklahoma for that adjunct training. And then the war ended, and all my shipmates and stuff like that were gone. They already got to go home, and I'm still sitting there waiting to go back to that deal there. But when that was over, like I said, I had extended for 2 years, and I think on March of 1946, I got sent aboard the USS St. Paul, a heavy cruiser.
Oh,
I was the only aviation metalsmith aboard, and I had my own shop, a little shop. I had a bunk in there. It was like an office also. And so that was the best duty I had all the while I was in the Navy, was there aboard the USS St. Paul.
So really quickly, and we're going to jump to the next clip on more on St. Paul. So VJ Day occurred while he was on the island, while he was on the atoll. And you already mentioned this, Ryan. You were doing the math in 41. If it's a 4-year hitch, it's like, oh, 41, 42, 43, 40. Yeah, holy crap, 45, mid 45. The war was not over. And he decided to sign up for 2 more years when a lot of guys were doing everything they could to get out of there. And that would mean that there wouldn't be like this hero homecoming for him. He was going to be in the Navy, obviously, for quite a time after the wars ended. And he went on the St. Paul, which was a Baltimore class heavy cruiser. Beautiful ship, very powerful, probably the best heavy cruiser of the war, named after the city the capital city from the state that he's from, Minnesota.
Okay. Great.
And so really quick, we'll go to the next clip. He's going to talk more about what he did on this ship post-war.
so the St. Paul was named after a city from Minnesota, and you're this kid that grew up in that area, and it was this amazing Baltimore class heavy cruiser. I mean, what was it like serving on this old warship, or this new warship? It would have been new when you were on it.
Well, we had 3 aircraft aboard. There was a hangar deck, and then the 2 catapults, the 2 launching pads. Those catapult tracks were 70 feet long. Mm-hmm. That airplane went from a dead standstill to flying speed in 70 feet.
Oh, my Lord.
That pilot would be leaning back against, braced against the headrest and stuff. Boom! He had to be careful. The guy that was operating the catapult had to be very careful. If you want to get it when the bow of the ship is coming up, and if you're launching the one over here on the starboard side, you want the ship to be rolling to this side, so you shoot him off into the air instead of down into the water. Yeah, it was my job. My job then, besides being the metalsmith, when that aircraft landed, I had to refuel it, and stuff like that. And at that time, they didn't have the nozzle that would shut off when the fuel got to that level. It was just a free flow. And I was up there one day fueling, and my hearing was failing me at that time. And I for some reason, you could hear that when that fuel got up to as close to that nozzle. When it hit the end of the nozzle, there would be a change in the sound, and that's when you had to let it go right quick. And for some reason, I didn't hear it, and that 100 octane fuel came out like that, got in my eyes and everything. I couldn't see anything for 3 or 4 days. I thought I had lost my sight, and I was doused with 100 octane gasoline. If there had been a point of ignition, I would have been cremated right there on the ladder of that ship, that aircraft.
Can you imagine surviving Pearl Harbor, getting bombed and shot at, Majuro Atoll, and then you go in the post-war Navy, and that happens to you?
Well, it just goes to show, just like it was when he was a kid, there's a lot of ways to die,
That's true.
And now you're in the military that specializes in dealing out ways to die. And unfortunately, you might get caught up in it on your end of things. That's amazing. That's crazy.
And the other thing I'm thinking about, he just gave us his, perspective, as the catapult operator and metalsmith. When the pilot is sitting in his plane and you're hoping that they don't launch you into a wave, and then you're going to where you can fly in 70 feet, you must have blacked out for a second. There must be a second where your vision just goes to a couple of pinpricks, and then it opens up again. You're like, okay, let's push the throttle forward.
It's like a wormhole, right?
Exactly.
No, and I wonder, does the pilot obviously gun it right before they're like, all right, 3, 2, 1, and you just gun it right before they hit launch?
It feels like the right thing to do.
Yeah. Otherwise, I mean, obviously you need to be able to pick right up where you left off, right? So to speak,
because there's no way
crazy.
that the blood stays where it's supposed to in that second when you're going from 0 to 70 in 1 second. But yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. There's a lot of dangerous things on the ship, and he just talked about almost becoming a torch. But man, there's no freaking way I'd want to be one of those pilots on those seaplanes.
It'd be quite a ride, that's for sure.
Amen. So we're gonna play the next 2 clips back to back because it's about a homecoming. Now, a lot of times when we have this, there is a homecoming, but he's enlisted for 2 additional years, and all the parades are gone. What is that like? Well, you're about ready to hear.
By then, all of the parades and all of that stuff was over, and I came back from the Navy. Then I got out, I think, on May, what was it, May 25th of 1947, if I remember right. Yes, 6 years, 1 month, and 22 days I spent in the service. But by now, all of the parades were over and all of that stuff was over. And we were looked at more as competitors for the jobs, the automobiles, the housing, the available women, whatever the case may be, And so I missed out on all of that. We weren't the returning heroes. We were just competitors. My younger brother had joined the Navy, and he was home on leave, and he had to report back here to Treasure Island here in San Francisco Bay. And he was going to buy a bus ticket. I told him, no, I'll take you back, because there's nothing going on here. So I came here then to California in 1950, and I have been here since. The one thing I'd really like to ask and hope that this will do, that this will help to get people to remember all of my sunken shipmates and fallen comrades. We went back to Pearl Harbor, I think it was in 2010. And when I went from that white boat that took us out to the USS Arizona Memorial, walking from where that boat tied up over to the memorial itself, look over the side to haul that vessel resting there on the bottom of the harbor. I made a solemn promise to those individuals that I would do something. I didn't know what it was or how I would go about it, but that I would do something to try to bring to them the well-deserved honor and continued remembrance that they so rightfully deserve. And I hope that by doing this and having this time on the air, that it will get people to think about and to remember all of those individuals, not only those there just at Pearl Harbor, but anywhere and everywhere. Those individuals who have answered the call of their country, who have stepped forward to provide, protect, and preserve those liberties and those freedoms that they take for granted.
And I want to stand up and applaud.
That's a mic
drop. That is a mic drop there. I don't have anything that's worthy to add to that. I mean, what a privilege it was for us to be able to talk to Mr. Kohler. What a privilege it is to have him honored, at this concert that's going to happen on Memorial Day, the Memorial Day concert in DC. Everybody out there, honestly, by the time you're listening to this, the concert will have already happened, but you should still be able to view it on the PBS website and everything. Go out there, tell your friends about Mr. Kohler's story and everything. This is the sort of thing that, honestly, it's why Tony and I do this sort of thing that we do. A lot of people think, well, we're just super geeks, and we are, but at the same time, we're trying to help preserve history in our own way. And this is the only way we know how to do it. And to have Mr. Kohler thank us for letting him tell his story, and he's hoping that in some way this furthers his promise that he made to his shipmates as they stood on the Arizona Memorial. I am honored to even be a part this whole effort that he's undertaking here. So, Tony, I don't really have anything else to say. That's crazy stuff.
And I don't either. I think we're just going to wrap this up because I think he just said everything that needs to be said in that closing statement. So with that being said, audience, thank you for joining us on our journey. Hope you enjoyed the clips. Please do check out the memorial concert, the recording of it. He's going to be featured in that in some way that we don't even know yet. They're keeping it a state secret. Yeah, we'll find out. And with that being said, my name is Tony Lupo.
And I'm Ryan Fairfield.
And thank you for joining us for another episode of the Warrior Next Door podcast. Caw. Warrior Next Door listeners, we sure hope that you enjoyed hearing Chuck Kohler tell us about his experiences during World War II and at Pearl Harbor, as much as we enjoyed getting to know him, interviewing him, and producing this for our audience. We also want to do a shout out for the affiliates at PBS for hooking us up with Chuck, for being able to identify us as someone who could interview him and share his story. And we have a lot more on tap coming up for the remainder of 2026, which has already been a remarkable year for the Warrior Next Door. So please be a part of that. If you have a chance to like us or subscribe to us on your podcast or on Facebook, it is much, much appreciated and really helps support the show. So until next week.